Welcome back, everybody. So today we are going to continue our series that we started on the history of the Chevrolet V8 engines. Most of you have probably seen the small block video that we did. If you haven't seen that, I'll put a link down in the description if you're interested in the small block engine history. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and we're going to start talking about the Chevrolet big block engine and the history of the larger cubic inch, the bigger, physically bigger size. Now a lot of people have this idea that the big block and small block is based on the cubic inches of the engine. The reality is GM is one of the few manufacturers that actually made a distinction of big block and small block, and not in all of their lines. Pontiac, for example, has a lot of different cubic inch sizes, but they don't have a big block or a small block. Their 350 and their 455 are the same size block. They don't make a distinction big block or small block. They are simply just a Pontiac. Now, with the Chevrolet, the distinction between the big block and the small block really has nothing to do with cubic inches. Chevrolet actually has a 400 cubic inch small block, and as we'll see later in the video, they have a 366 cubic inch big block. So the distinction when it comes to GM and Chevrolet between big block and small block was the actual physical size of the engine. If you look at a big block Chevy and a small block Chevy next to each other, like we see here, you will notice that the big block Chevy is physically much bigger. It's a larger engine, it has much larger bore spacing, and it has a capacity for a much larger cubic inch capability simply because the bores are further apart, and it's just a much larger engine that can hold larger internals, much larger cylinders and crankshafts. Also, another thing to remember is I've had people ask me, well, you know, if they have a 400 small block, why did they make a 366 cubic inch big block? The short answer to that question is this. Chevrolet, and a lot of manufacturers for that matter, they wanted a bigger, heavier engine for their large trucks. The small block Chevrolet, while a very powerful engine and very versatile, wasn't really as beefy as they wanted it to be for some of the larger heavy-duty applications. Now, the benefit to that is those of us that are interested in the muscle car, they were actually able to take this larger, beefier engine and stuff it into a car and make a hot rod engine out of it, and that's a big benefit. But really, the original idea was to make a stronger for their bigger, heavier duty applications. So the first big block was what we call the W series engine. Now, not a lot of people nowadays are familiar with these because they only lasted for a few years, but they were really the first actual big block that GM produced. The first one was 348 cubic inches. Now, the W engine was unique. One of the things that was unique about it is they had a very distinctly shaped valve cover that looked a lot like a W. The other really distinct design feature of this engine was that it had a flat cylinder head. The combustion chamber was largely incorporated into the block. What they did is at the top of the cylinder, they changed the angle of the deck in respect to the angle of the bore, and they created a combustion chamber inside the cylinder. And then they just produced a flat cylinder head that sat on top of the cylinder, and combined with this extra area at the top of the cylinder and the piston shape, they were able to make a wedge type chamber. So most of the combustion chamber was actually in the block and not the cylinder head. Now, there was a portion of the cylinder head that made up some of the combustion chamber with some notch. They could change the compression ratio of the engine by making this area of the cylinder head either smaller or larger. And that was one of the things they did with some of the variations of the engine. So the 348 was produced starting in 1958, and it ranged in horsepower from 250 all the way up to 348, which made it 1 horsepower per cubic inch, which at that time, just like the 283, was a pretty revolutionary feat. But it was something that a lot of the manufacturers were catching on to at the time. Ford was doing the same thing with their bigger engines. The 348 came with either a Carter 4-barrel or 3 Rochester 2-barrels, which was called 3 Deuces, which is known as the Tri-Power or the 3 Deuces carburetor setup. There were several different versions of the 348, varying in horsepower ranges and torques depending on the model that they were in. The 348 had a bore diameter of 4.125 and a stroke of 3.250. The 348 was produced between 1958 and 1964. In 1961, they also produced another version of the 348. They increased the bore and the stroke of the W engine to make a 409 cubic inch engine. Now the 409 was actually one of the first real hot rod factory performance engines that was available. In the early 60s, the 409 was in the SS Impala. Chevrolet introduced the Super Sport model for the first time, and it was in an Impala with the 409. Now the 409 was available with either a single 4-barrel or dual 4-barrel carburetors. The dual 4-barrel carburetor version of the 409 was a real hot rod. The 409 had a 4.310 bore, which is quite large, and a 3.5-inch stroke. It ranged in horsepower from 360 all the way up to 425. The dual quad version in the Super Sport made 425 horsepower, which made for a very potent street machine. So the 409 was a very solid engine. One of the weak points of the 409 is it had a weaker connecting rod in it. The connecting rods weren't really the greatest, but those could be upgraded when you rebuilt the engine with a better connecting rod. Now, there was another version of that was a very limited production. They only made 50 cars, but a lot of people don't know this. They actually took the 409 and they made a 427. Now, the 427 was a factory race engine. It was a factory hot rod that was designed to be marketed to drag racers and circle track racers. It was used in NHRA and in NASCAR. This was known as the Z11 project. The Z11 1963 Sport Coupe Impala was equipped with the W configuration of the 427 engine. Very specialized vehicle. There was actually a lot of components on this car that were manufactured out of aluminum rather than steel. And so it wasn't just your average 63 Impala. It was a sport coupe. It was a very stripped down model, had no bells and whistles. It was basically a drag race car or a circle track car. And it came equipped with the 427W engine. GM actually only produced 50 of these cars because the sales of the car didn't really take off. They thought it was going to be a much larger boom than it actually was. When they initially rolled it out, there wasn't really too much interest in it, basically because the car was just so expensive, a lot of people couldn't afford it. But they did make 50 of these vehicles with this 427W engine. If you were to actually find one of these vehicles today, it's probably worth its weight in gold. But it was a factory production car, although production was very limited. The 427 was 13.5-to-1 compression from the factory, so it was a real hot rod engine. Couple that with dual four barrels, high flowing dual exhaust, and a factory aluminum intake manifold, and this thing was a real power. Now the actual horsepower numbers of the 427, nobody really knows. This was kind of a cloudy issue. They advertised 430 horsepower, but the reality is most of these engines were producing well over 500 horsepower. GM never actually advertised that, but we know just from the experience that people had with it in dyno tests and racing that it was well over 500 horsepower. You know, if you think about it, the 409 was 425 horsepower. It doesn't make sense that they went to all this trouble for the 427 to gain 5 horsepower. But they said it was 430. The reality is, yeah, way more than that. So all in all, a very interesting engine. It's unique. When you pop the hood and it has one of these W409, 348 under the hood, there's no mistaking it. It's because of the W-shaped valve cover. It's clear, it's obvious that this was the W big block engine. So the next generation was a Generation 2 big block Chevrolet engine. The Generation 2 big block was what was known as the Mystery engine. It was an engine that was developed and used in NASCAR racing. Nobody really knew much about this engine. Never actually got out of the racing world, and it was never produced in a vehicle. Then they went to Generation 3. Now Generation 3 was a situation where GM wanted to build this big block. They spent a lot of time and effort developing the engine on the drawing board, but it never got off of the drawing board, mainly because they didn't have the tooling or the capability to cast the block. So they made a deal with Packard at the time, who had the capability to cast the block with the bore size they needed. But that deal actually fell through, and so the Generation 3 was never produced, never left the drawing board. Generation 4 was the one that they actually produced. So in 1965, they tooled up and started producing the Generation 4 big block Chevy. So with the Generation 4, I will walk you through the cubic inch sizes. I'm just gonna walk and start with the lowest cubic inch and work my way up. The smallest engine that they cast in Generation 4 was a 366 cubic inch truck motor. Now this engine never found its way into production cars and pickup trucks. It was basically a heavy-duty truck engine. It was found in some specially built police cars in the 70s and some ambulances, but it was used in all kinds of industrial applications for the bigger, heavier GMC truck line. It was used for industrial pumps and generators, things like that. The 366 was a small valve, small port torque motor. It was not really an engine that was any good for high performance. It was basically a truck engine designed to make torque. It had a small bore, smaller than 4 inches, 3.935, and it had a 3.760 stroke. It produced about 220 horsepower at its highest level, and there were some lower horsepower versions, but it did put out really good torque numbers, right around 400 to 425 foot-pounds of torque. But like I say, that's what it was built for. It was a purpose-built low RPM torque engine for trucks. The next engine they produced, starting in 1965, and this was really the first passenger car light truck big block, was the 396 cubic inches. The 396 had a 4-inch .094 bore and a 3.760 crankshaft. Now the 396 was really the big block that kind of made the big blocks infamous. There were several versions of the engine ranging in horsepower from 375 with 415 foot-pounds of torque, but they did make a Corvette version of it that year that was 425 horsepower and 450 foot-pounds of torque. That was a real powerhouse. This was a 12.5 to 1 compression engine with big square port heads, pop-up pistons, forged crankshaft, the big dimple rods with the bigger bolts, forged pistons. This was a real powerhouse, this 396 that came out in '65 in the Corvettes. And it was the predecessor to most of the big power big blocks that came after it. Now in 1970, the 396 morphed into what they called the 402. I've had conversations with guys that had a Chevelle with a 402 in it, and you call it a 396, and they're like, oh, don't call it a 396, that's a 402, man. I got a 402. The 402 is the exact same engine as the 396 with one difference. They took and they bored the cylinders out 30 thousandths. The reason they bored the cylinders of the 396 out 30 thousandths in 1970 was not because they wanted to improve the performance of the engine. In fact, it didn't improve the performance of the engine. The engine made exactly the same horsepower. They made a version of the 402 with 12.5 to 1 compression, just like the early Corvette 396. It was basically the same configuration, and it made exactly the same horsepower. It made 425 horsepower and 450 foot-pounds of torque. They also had lower rated versions of the engine that were 375, and there was one even lower than that, because they lowered the compression in it. The reasoning behind boring the 396 out was simply because in 1970 the EPA And the California, especially emissions police, came out with a mandate, and they said, listen, if you're gonna build an engine in a passenger car, you're going to have to put all of these emissions restrictions on it. We're going to make you put an air pump and a smog pump on it. There has to be, we have these requirements and these restrictions because we're trying to restrict the emissions and the fuel mileage and all kinds of stuff. There's fuel mileage mandates. But they said, you know what? If the engine's over 400 cubic inches, it's exempt for now. We're going to say under 400 cubic inches, you got to adhere to all this EPA smog stuff. Over 400 cubic inches, because the way the EPA was thinking, they're like, you know, if it's over 400 cubic inches, it's probably limited production for a truck. Passenger cars are going to be 400 or below. So GM said, oh, well, you know, our 396 is going to be subject to all of these EPA restrictions. So what'd they do? They bored the 396 block 30 over and made it a 402. And they're like, hey, this is not a 396, it's a 402. This is a bigger engine now. Technically, yes, it was a few cubic inches bigger, but 30 thousandths overboard does not make one bit of difference in power output. A lot of people think it does. You know, you talk to them about their engine. Oh, what'd you do to your engine, man? Oh yeah, oh man, they bored it over, dude. It's so powerful now. And it's like, you're like, no, boring it over doesn't do anything, especially not 30 over. It doesn't improve the performance. The difference is nominal, you know, and they'll say, oh, well, it runs way better now. Well, yeah, that's because boring the cylinders is a repair. They fixed the tapered and out around cylinders and corrected the 80% leakage that your cylinders had when it was all worn out. And of course it runs better because they sealed up the cylinder. It's not because it's so much bigger. It's not. 30 thousandths is very, very small. We're talking the difference in the human hair range is how much bigger that is. So that was really the 402 deal. Now the next engine that we have to talk about, of course, is the 427. In 1966, the 427 came out, and what they did is they cast the block with a larger bore. They bumped the bore up to 4.250, and they used the same 396 stroke crank, which is 3.760. So the 366, the 396, and the 402 and the 427 all shared the same crankshaft. Now what's interesting about the 366 is a lot of, like where I lived in a rural area, farmers would always pull the 366 out if something went wrong with a motor, and they would just throw it in their barn and they would replace it with a 427 truck block because it had a lot more power. And they would always, you know, you'd always hear them say, oh, those 366s are underpowered. I'm not going to use that motor. That's, you know, they'd say that thing's worthless for anything. We want the bigger 427 truck engine that was available. And they would just cast those 366s aside. Several times I purchased one of those 366s for one reason. Number one, the farmers didn't like them, or the companies that were using them didn't like them, and they just kind of set them aside, and you could pick them up cheap. But you have to remember that those 366s were a fantastic source for forged 427 crankshafts. So if you took the 366 crank and you put it into a 454 block, which was readily available after 1970, you've got a 427. So it was just keep in mind, much like we talked about in the small block video where the 307 was a fantastic source for 327 crankshafts, the 366 is a fantastic source for cheap forged 427 crankshafts. So that's something to keep in mind. Those 366s, if you see one that's laying around cheap, snap that thing up because you've got the makings of a really nice 427. Now, the 427 in the Corvette and the L71 version had forged pistons, high compression. They made 435 horsepower and 450 foot-pounds of torque. They actually did make lower horsepower versions of the 427, around 390 horsepower and 425 foot-pounds of torque for the big family station wagons, the passenger cars. And they actually made a 2-barrel version of the 427, which is surprising, but they did. Now the L88 was really kind of the factory production granddaddy of the 427. It came from the factory with bigger forged rods, forged pistons, forged crankshaft, 12.5-to-1 compression, and big square port heads. This engine produced 430 horsepower and well north of 450 foot-pounds of torque, although there's arguments about what the torque that this engine actually had, but GM says around 435. Dyno testers have said it has a lot more than that, but you know, we'll go with what GM said. In '69, there was a ZL1 version of the 427, which was an all-aluminum engine that really never saw production. It was north of 500 horsepower with no published torque numbers. It was available as a crate motor over the counter. It was basically a race engine that was available over the counter from GM that you could buy. They didn't sell that many of them because they were really expensive at the time, but that was a 500 horsepower crate engine that was available from GM in the 427 cubic inch Gen 4 design. The next engine we have on our list is the 454. In 1970, GM took the same block that was used for the 427 and they put a longer stroke crank in it. So it was a 4.250 bore with a 4-inch stroke. Now the 454 in 1970 had two basic versions, the LS5 and the LS6. The LS5 was a milder engine that was available, although it was no slouch, coming in at 390 horsepower and 450 foot-pounds of torque, and they put this in just about everything. The LS6 was the next stage up from that, and this was really the granddaddy of the production car engines. In the 1970 Super Sport Chevelle, this engine was rated at 450 horsepower and 500 foot-pounds of torque, although those numbers have been reported to be way under-exaggerated. Independent engine dyno tests of the LS6 have rated that engine north of 485 horsepower and 550 foot-pounds of torque, which is more realistic. When you look at the quarter-mile times that the 70 Chevelle ran, the higher numbers actually make a lot more sense. Now, the 454 was used for many, many years, all the way up into the 90s. The horsepower ranges of the 454 were from the LS6, which was the highest horsepower production engine, all the way down to about 230 horsepower and 375 foot-pounds of torque in the 90s pickup trucks, in the SS 454 pickup trucks, and some of the even the non-SS trucks had that basic 454 in it. The 454 extended all the way into the Generation 5 and Generation 6 engines. These engines were fitted with factory roller cams and fuel injection, and they were a one-piece rear main seal block, which was a little bit different design. Nevertheless, they retained the 454 cubic inch size, and they were mainly found in pickup trucks. There wasn't really any passenger cars that got these 454s in the later years up into the 90s. And they were the lower horsepower, lower torque versions of the engine. Although they are engines that you can find and build, especially the Generation 6, it had a lot in common with the Generation 4. There were things about the engine that were different, like no fuel pump provision for a mechanical fuel pump and things like that, because it was a factory fuel injected engine. Now, GM did have a whole slew of big block crate motors that were available, starting with the 502. Now the 502 was a 4.446 bore with a 4-inch stroke. So it had a much larger bore, shared the stroke with the 454. This was an over-the-counter crate engine that was available. They also used this in marine applications. Some of the lower horsepower versions of it were 350 horsepower. The over-the-counter crate engine was around 500 horsepower, and the torque wasn't really published on that, although they estimate around 600 foot-pounds of torque. The Ramjet 502 was an over-the-counter crate engine that was turnkey. It came with fuel injection, computer wiring harness, the whole shot, ready to bolt in, plug in, and go. And it was rated over 500 horsepower from GM over-the-counter. The next crate motor, as we go up in cubic inches, was the ZZ572. Now the ZZ572 was a real powerhouse. It had a 4.560 bore and a 4.375 stroke. So they lengthened the stroke of it. They had a pump gas version of this engine that made 620 horsepower guaranteed and 650 foot-pounds of torque with a warranty from GM. Fantastic crate motor. And it had all the bells and whistles, all forged internals, really good high-flowing heads and high-performance intake manifold. They also had a racing fuel version of the 572 that was rated at 720 horsepower, and the torque numbers were never published by GM. They guaranteed 720 horsepower, but it was a high compression race gas version. Then we have to talk about the 632. Now the 632 crate engine was the granddaddy of all the big blocks. It had a 4-inch 600 thousandths bore and a 4 3/4 inch stroke. It's almost hard to believe they could get that much stroke into it. But the 632 was a fantastic high performance engine available from GM. And if you had the money, and this was the one you really wanted. It was rated at 1,094 horsepower and 875 foot-pounds of torque from GM with a warranty. It had a new design cylinder head. The same engineer that designed the LS1 heads developed the heads for the 632, and it had the symmetrical intake and exhaust port design where every port was exactly the same. So they really did a lot of advanced work on the cylinder heads for the 632. And it had really, really good flow numbers, and that's one of the ways they were able to get the big horsepower out of it. This was a high performance engine. It was not for a run around town stock type vehicle. It was a race motor, plain and simple, at its very core. Now there were guys that put these in street cars, but they were just absolute screamers. They were street rods. They weren't something that you would drive daily. So that is basically a rundown of the big block Chevy that was available for many, many years. They made millions of these things. One of the most readily available big block Chevys is the 454. There's tons of them out there. One of the things that has happened is because of the newer LS engines, the LS engine came along and kind of replaced a lot of the factory big blocks as far as people building hot rods. And so the price of the big block cores has come down. You can pick up a decent 454 anywhere. If you want 700 horsepower, very easy to do with a 454. All you do is get a 454 block, have it prepped and machined. You can build a stroker, a 496, put a stroker crank in it. You get some really good aftermarket aluminum heads and a good cam combination, and it's very easy to make 700 horsepower with a 454 or 496 nowadays. So that is basically the history of the big block. If you have any questions, make sure you ask below. Make sure you subscribe and like. I will talk to you very soon, I promise.